Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. And it's a bit of a different setup, but it's one that we actually had foreseen from the start, that I needed to be at CERN this week for different events. There are actually 2 experiments running in parallel where I am very deeply involved. We just completed a very important run at the Medicis facility, and we have the PRISMAP consortium meeting happening as well. So it's a very busy week at the CERN side of things. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all from CERN. As you can see here, the ISOL, the logo behind me, this little thing here as well. This is an ISOL target. And behind that window there is actually the ISOL experimental hall where my colleagues are performing an experiment on radium fluoride at the moment. The other thing is that we've all learned that Belgium has been striked with new regulations concerning the evolution of the pandemic, through which many of us are now required to be teleworking, and that is impacting a lot in our daily activities. So as such, having this meeting online today is maybe a bonus, as many of us would otherwise not maybe have had the opportunity to be at SCK. And this is why also it is foreseen that the following lecture is likely to be held in an online setting as well in light of this. And I'm sure that the SCK Academy will contact all of you in the course of the week to confirm that situation and let you know exactly how this will go. But with no further ado, let's start with today. And my first question is actually going to be to you. How is it going today? So since I cannot see you, I see a screen full of letters that tell me your initials, but not so much about your face. I cannot quite see how happy you are to see me. So I've decided to ask you a few polls every now and then about how what you think, how is it going, and so on and so forth. So now Tom has shared the link to that poll with you. You just have to click that link and you can start answering and letting us know how you're feeling today. Well, I'm guessing the sun must be shining in Belgium today because everyone is doing pretty well. I'm glad to hear, and I'm very happy to see you all here. So we'll see then, indeed, whether I can keep the mood up and maybe make you even more happy with what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So the outline of today's lecture is going to be about the basics. Well, today we're talking about nuclear medicine. So I will be talking to you about some basics of nuclear medicine, then about theranostic opportunities with novel radioisotopes. So how can we do more with a new combination, a new set of radioisotopes? And then finally, I will talk about the importance of radioactive ion beams and in particular of the isotope separation online technique in realizing those opportunities in nuclear medicine. As you can see, it is nicely divided in 3 blocks, which means we will have 2 breaks today instead of 1, so that we can stretch our legs and rest our eyes from staring at the screen. Good. But first, let's talk about the basics of nuclear medicine. It all starts with molecular imaging. So in this idea, you have a radionuclide represented in this little drawing here by this icon that is transported to a specific location in the body. And then there are different ways through which this can go. We're going to discuss that in the next slide. And you can see how here, for example, it binds to a marker on a cell. And from there, it can actually emit gamma rays that will then be the source of what you can actually image. What happens is that those gamma rays, they can actually penetrate very far away. If you look at what are the stopping powers of the different particles emitted in radioactive decay, you have the alpha particle, which is very heavy, a core of helium-4, and it stops in paper. It would stop actually at the surface of your skin. So it would not penetrate through your body. Then you have the beta minus particles, which, oops, this is not happy. Voila. We have the beta minus particles, which will penetrate a bit deeper, but will be stopped by a thin layer of aluminium, a thin layer of plastic, a bit of water. So same thing, it does not leave the tissue. So that leaves us with the gamma ray detector, the gamma rays, which can actually fly through so much that it leaves your body. And then if you put a detector outside of the body, you are able to image where that radioisotope was delivered in the body. And if you take different orientation, so there you can either have the camera rotate around the patient, or you can try to spin the patient like a pig in an oven, although that's apparently not very well appreciated by patients, so usually we spin the camera. You can then create a 3D reconstruction of the image. So how do you get that targeted action? That's actually key in the process. You have, well, what I myself sort of divide into three main categories. The first one is the easiest one in a way. Yeah, sorry. This one is the easiest one. Those are the elements that naturally, specifically go to a location in the body. And we all know that iodine goes to the thyroid. So then you can target thyroid cells with iodine. Calcium goes to the bones. So you can target bone visualization with calcium or calcium equivalent, and so on and so forth. There aren't so many elements that are so specific, but there are a few of them. And so if you can use them, that's always a benefit. Then the second way is to use a molecule that can actually, in which you can replace part of the molecule by something else. So you take, for example, a sugar molecule. You remove an OH complex and put instead a radioactive fluorine, and then you create FDG. So in that case, you can also replace your one carbon atom by a radioactive carbon, or an oxygen atom with a radioactive oxygen, a nitrogen atom with a radioactive nitrogen, and so on and so forth. And you can use their radiation properties to image exactly what's happening to that molecule. And the third option that you get is actually to use like a massive molecule that will go to a specific place in the body, a specific cell membrane marker, or that is absorbed by a specific way by the system, and then attach to it with a chelator a radioactive isotope so that you can bring it as a payload to your destination. And those targeting molecules are of several types. You can have either peptides, hormones, or antibodies. However, there is something that's rather very important about those. They have different sizes, and different sizes means different time that it takes to go through your body. That leads to different biodistribution. And there you have to be very careful that the radioisotope you attach to that isotope is actually well matched to the half-life so both the biodistribution and the half-life are well matched with each other. So that brings us then to molecular imaging and how this is used in practice in different sort of aspects. Sorry, I'm going to have to remove my markings. Let's start with what is sometimes seen as the easiest form of molecular imaging, that's SPECT, single photon emission computed tomography. The idea there is that you use a gamma ray that has somewhat low energy. It's high enough in energy that it can leave the body, but it's low enough that it will be very well detected by cameras, and so you can be very efficient in looking at it. The most well-known isotope for that is technetium-99m, and it's 140 keV gamma ray. But you have other cases you can use. Here I talk about the indium-111, the lutetium-177. You have iodine-123. You have quite a few of those isotopes that you can actually use for SPECT imaging. Since in this case it's a single photon that actually leaves the body and that comes into the detector. So you don't need actually high resolution. You know you will only have that gamma ray energy, but you need to be very sensitive. You need to also have a good idea of the position from where it's come, and therefore you use scintillator detectors for that. The image resolution will also require that the radiation comes orthogonally, and this is what you have represented in that part here of the picture, where you see how different line of sights will reach the detector depending on the shape of your of the mask that you put in front of it, here with straight line, whereas the other one you have actually inclined lines, and also the length of your mask is also of great importance. And so the study of those masks and how they are adapted to the different elements and to the different radiations is the issue most of the time with SPECT imaging. Then there is the PET imaging, and there I was looking for a good image, so I Googled for you PET image, and of course Google returned something that was totally inappropriate for me, so I apologize for you. I am not going to talk about your favorite companion, but instead about positron emission tomography. So here the source of the radiation is actually not directly a gamma ray photon. What happens is that you use a positron emitting isotope that will decay by beta plus decay, and this is what is explained here in this representation, where you have an electron and a positron joining together and forming what is called a positronium that will annihilate and create the emission of two gamma ray photons here and there that come out in exactly diametrically opposing directions, so with a very nice 180-degree off from each other and exactly the same energy of 500 keV. And so when you detect those two photons here with an array of detectors that are placed all around the patient, then you get to see the line of sight. So in this case, if this two detector fires, you know that something has happened along this line. And the resolution will depend on the granularity of your detector, that is, how many small detectors you put all around. The other thing is, if you see here that the event occurred at not quite the halfway point, but a bit off from that, you see that there is a difference in how fast the gamma ray will travel to the upper detector with respect to the lower detector. And that time difference can be used as well to measure not only the axis along which the radiation was coming, but its original point. And this is what we call time of flight positron emission tomography, which is a rather recent development that is still the source of much research in our university hospitals. And the typical isotopes that are known for that are the ones that I've mentioned already to you before, which is fluorine 18, for example, that is used in those sugar equivalent FDG. Then there is carbon 11, oxygen 15, those are the replacement isotopes I was mentioning before. But you may also use gallium 68, another positron emitter, this time which you combine with a chelator with the vector distribution mechanism. So all of that gives us the idea of functional imaging. What you look at is not an organ. You're not going to find the liver, you're not going to find the heart. What you're going to find there is a process, a function that goes on in the body. So what you will observe is where sugar is being taken by the body, where iodine is traveling to. And it doesn't mean it's an image of that organ. Of course, it can be sometimes associated, but what you really would like to have is a good superposition of both. Take a picture of the thyroid, take a picture of thyroid activity, and verify that the entirety of it is working. If you see as well the two pictures on the right, they are PET images, and I have no clue about what they're picturing. Is that the brain? Is that a section of a thorax? Is that, I don't know. Because the reason is that you do not have on top of it a superposition of the structural image of the body. And this is a very important aspect. Functional imaging on its own isn't sufficient. And this is why I also wanted to attract your attention to computed tomography, CT scans, which are essential. They're sort of very advanced X-ray systems where you shine an intense X-ray beam through the body, through the patient, and then you estimate the absorption into the body by having the camera on the other side. So you can see here it says it's 20 to 200 keV X-rays that are used for that, and the attenuation gives us the information about the sort of tissue that it goes through, so that it can differentiate between a soft tissue, between bone, and so on and so forth. And there, the position resolution, of course, is very important to get the right information, and the reconstruction algorithm to get a very high quality 3D image. And with this combined functional and structural imaging, you get to make actually exciting picture like this. So this is here what you can see from combining PET or SPECT imaging together with high quality CT scans. And there you can immediately say, okay, this is what's happening. For example, you always notice at the bottom of the body that you do have extra lighting area as well. This is typically the bladder, because most of the radioisotope that are injected are actually excreted via the bladder from the body. So that's why those tend to always light up. But you can see that many organs in those different persons are also highlighted. Now, I have a bit of a twister for you here. And that's a question. In which directions do the bodies turn? You know, there were two bodies on those figures. It will come back in a second, don't worry. But then the question for you is, are they both turning with the front going right, with the front going left? Or are they in opposite direction, or in opposite direction the other way? What is it? Okay, have a good look and then you can vote. Well, actually, I have been training myself into interpreting those images. It's like the ballerina jumping on her feet, right? And I get to see all four of them if I want to, depending on how I twist them. But yeah, it was just for the fun of it, because when I downloaded them, it was like, clearly that one is turning in one direction and that one is turning in another. And then I put them both on the slides and they were both turning in the same direction, and I was a bit, yeah, getting crazy at that. And I wanted to share that crazy moment with you. But yes, there is not much more than that. Good. However, the important part of this image, besides this little funny moment, is actually that the image alignment is not trivial. And you can see here how open we were to interpretation as to what we see here. I mean, it's not quite the same, but it is all still a very good illustration to say that you do have a lot of degrees of freedom in those. And so you need to have systems that will make sure that the functional images that you collect and the structural images that you've collected will overlap perfectly. So what is very often done these days is actually to combine the machines together, to have a PET scanner and a CT scanner that go hand in hand, so that you put the patient on a bed and the bed goes through the two devices, so that the images are taken in sequential time with very little difference, but also with no motion of the patient that could change something in the process. So that's a very important aspect, and also a source of a lot of headache in the medical sector. Then you have to also consider the same question for little animals, because a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about later today is about research, not yet the practice on humans. And so when you go to preclinical levels, you first want to test how those novel radioisotopes are performing in a real mammal. And so you start with little animals, and then you need to image little animals. While you can tell the patient, oh, please do not move and try to monitor your breathing and let us play you some calming music and something that will make your breathing more regular and so on, you cannot quite tell a mouse to relax. So instead, they are typically sedated for a lot of these activities, and they are put in little beds. And you can see here one of those little beds. It looks like a tube about, I would say, maybe 8 to 10 centimeter diameter, in which the animal is placed so that you would have reproducible conditions. And to perform those preclinical research, then we use what is called microspect, micropet, macro MRI, macro CT machines. And they can be quite bulky and not very practical to work with, except that colleagues from the University of Ghent have developed a very compact system, which now turned into a successful spin-off. I wanted to highlight here, not that I have any shares in their company, I just think they did a really very good job with that, called the Molecubes, where they can actually even combine multiple imaging capabilities. So they're very handy machines for preclinical imaging. And as such, actually, KU Leuven has recently upgraded their lab with a few of those machines in their Mosaic infrastructure so that they can perform very efficient and high quality images like that. But also the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, which is one of the leader in the sort of molecular imaging research, have some of those machines. I've seen the University of Chicago as well. So it's becoming quite popular to have those. And it is part of making sure your imaging is working all right. Good. But coming now then to how you go from, okay, making cool images, say you can locate a cancer with something like that if you have the right marker, or if you just look at where sugar is being taken up, because we know that very active cancers will be taking up a lot of sugar. So, okay, you've located it. What can we do with that? And there comes the idea of targeted radionuclide therapy, trying to bring a radioisotope to a cancer cell to eradicate it. How does that work? Well, you actually work somewhat in the same way as before. You replace your gamma ray emission this time with a particle emission. So the idea now is that your radioisotope will go boom with a charged particle instead of just a gamma ray that nicely penetrate. If you recall what I've said before, the beta particles will be going quite a few way. I mean, you may need something like aluminium, a few, like a certain thickness of tissue to go through. And here I've run, just for the heck of it, the simulation of what does a 1 MeV electron in water. And you can see it can go to 5 millimeters. So it tells you immediately you would want to go at least to less than an MeV. And just for comparison, I have also looked at 10 MeV alpha particle in water. And now I have to squint on this because it doesn't show quite well, but I think the length here was to 100 angstrom. The point being that it goes to a very small distance. We're talking that an alpha particle may stop within a few cell layers. So it's going to be acting quite differently. And Auger electrons, which is another form of radiation during radioactive decay, is actually not even leaving the inner part of a cell. So it can be very destructive, but it has to be delivered to the right place. And then the question is, what is the main source of cell death? How are you going to destroy the cell that you are targeting? And the answer is you want to destroy the DNA. You want to not only destroy that, you want to create beyond repair damage. So that's double strand breaking to the DNA. And this is something that is not quite easy. You need to have a lot of ionization for that. And you can see in their presentation here what happens, like a beta particle will make maybe one ionization here, but the next one will be far off. So a single beta ray in itself will not be enough to destroy. So you will need a lot of them and hope that you get crossfire of many so that eventually you get to see something happening. Whereas an alpha particle here, you can see, will induce a lot of damage at many places so that you are much more likely to induce cell death. And like if you see the Auger electron, then it's a fireworks that it does into the DNA. If you can bring the particle, the Auger emission, to the DNA, and that's the whole challenge of Auger therapy. Now, there are other mechanisms that can cause cell death. You can have ionization on the environment that can lead to hydrolysis of the DNA. You can have also damage to the cell membrane that is beyond repair. You can do damage to the mitochondria. So there are a lot of things that can happen, but it still gives an idea that the density of deionization is really what's causing most of the damage, and so that's why you really want to go to those alpha particles and those electrons. So let's look at exactly how things go and what we have at our disposal. But first, a quick recap on nuclear physics, because that's my field. I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a nuclear physicist. So I look back to that and I say, okay, beta decay, what does happen there? Charge -1, mass very, very small, it's the mass of the electron, and the energy is, MeV range. We tried to go to something lower than that. But then you have to actually realize that the beta decay is a very specific, a very peculiar decay, because in the process, you don't only have the emission of the recoil. You don't only have the emission of the recoil and the beta particle, but you also have this neutrino that leads to a continuum of energy. So it's not a single energy at, say, 1 MeV. It's going to be a lot of energies below. And this is what you see in the top right picture for the beta spectrum in red of lutetium-177. And you can see here that actually, although the endpoint energy is maybe 500 keV, it will distribute its energy at much lower energies than that. And that translates into how far actually the particle goes. And if you see in the image below, in blue for lutetium and in red for terbium 161, how far actually do the particle reach into the body, into the cell, and you see it doesn't even go to a millimeter compared to the 5 millimeter simulation I did before. That was very crude. Here it gives us a better idea of where it stops, and you can see especially the terbium will distribute a lot of its energy, so a lot of its ionization capability very early on in the first few cell layers, so that it may still have its very accurate and effective action. So now we can look as well at the alpha decay. Here the situation is a bit different. In alpha decay, you emit actually helium-4 nucleus, so it's 2 protons, 2 neutrons. The mass is already much bigger. It's actually 8,000 times bigger. So you can imagine comparing maybe a bike and a truck in terms of how it would stop and the sort of damage it would do. The charge is also +2, so it makes its action twice, its ionizing effect twice as important. And the energy is a few MeV. So if you look, for example, at the decay chain of actinium-225, which is represented in the top right, you can see that it sequentially alpha decays, and the daughter is also alpha decay. And I stop here at bismuth-213, but actually you could even say that the bismuth-213 beta decays then to polonium-213, which itself alpha decays again. And that's how you get to have 4 alpha particles emitted every single time you get a decay from actinium-225. So this time, not only is the alpha very efficient, but you get 4 of them for the price of 1. So that makes quite a big impact. So you can see in the bottom right picture the alpha decay spectroscopy study that one of my students performed recently on a sample of actinium-225 that was separated here at ISOL. At Medicis. Okay, so with that, we've actually seen now what the properties are of those things, how they can destroy the cells. So that brings us to the idea of teragnostics. And what is teragnostics? It's the idea of using a single vector molecule and interchangeably go between a gamma emitter for imaging and a charged particle emitter for therapy. If you prove with molecular imaging that you are targeting the cancer cells, for example, but you are not targeting healthy cells, then you validate that your treatment will work. And then you just swap your isotopes and you start the treatment. If you want to know if your treatment has worked, then you go back to imaging and you look at what has happened. And then you can go back and forth. You can also see what is the body response, what is the time distribution of that vector, what is the efficacy of its targeting action. And also that way you can estimate precisely how much dose you need to give to the patient. And so this idea that you can validate the treatment before trying it out, and afterwards you can also validate its efficacy and its progress, means you can really tailor the treatment, and you're not going to start treating every patient randomly without knowing if it's going to be a satisfying cure or not. You can really tailor it to each person's, and that's what brings us to the idea of personalized medicine. You're not going to give radioactivity and risk damaging the person's health if you don't know that it's going to work. And that's quite an important aspect of nuclear medicine. So it makes it very potent because you completely reduce the risk of affecting people that would not benefit from it. So you really weigh the benefit to risk a lot better with this approach. But then I have another question for you. Is it theranostics or theragnostics? I know it might sound trivial, but you cannot imagine the number of debates I've heard about that in conferences on the topic. So let's see how the vote is progressing. And we can see here that we have a very strong preference in the crowd for theranostics over the theragnostic. But let's see actually what it actually comes from. So it's the concatenation of therapy and diagnostics. But then when you look at the etymology of the word diagnostics, from the etymological point of view, theragnostics should be the word. The other one is completely made up and doesn't have any strong roots to etymology. However, if you do a very quick search on PubMed, it's the sort of scholarly article search engine for medical academic literature, then you see the big difference between those two. Theranostics returning thousands of paper, when the other one returns but a fraction of that, less than 200 when I did this search yesterday. So that is a big impact. However, I would say use the one you feel the most comfortable with. It's not like people will not understand if you use one or the other. Some may have pedantic opinions about which one is best. I think if we make it work, that's what should be the most important of all. So how does theragnostic look in practice? You don't use that for anything. You actually go for cancers that cannot be treated by other means, because it is still a very difficult kind of treatment. So you typically target distributed cancers, cancers that you cannot surgically remove, cancer that you cannot target with external beam therapy, whether it is gamma ray based, whether it is proton therapy, carbon therapy. You try to go for something that has the cancer spread all over the body. So typically cancer of the endocrine system is a good example, or metastasized cancer. There you have to identify the metabolic function and typically the overexpressed markers that will give you a targeted action through which you will be able to deliver your vector really to the cancer and minimize the impact on the healthy cells. And once you've validated that to the patient, then you can start doing the therapy. And here we have one of the, I would say, cover example, the cover poster of nuclear medicine that people really get very happy about. And that's a study that was done with patients with prostate cancer, castration-resistant prostate cancer, that was so badly metastasized in their body that they were given, at this stage here, about 6 months to live. And you see 6 months as of June 2015. And all the black spots you see in there are traces of cancer that have just grown out of control. And they tried, so here they identified that the PSMA, so the prostate specific membrane antigen, was responding to the PET imaging with gallium-68. And so they said, well, we're going to give you this experimental treatment with beta emission. So they used lutetium-177, and they had 2 injections of those. But of course, you have to realize the beta particles, they don't go too far, but they do reach to the healthy tissues. So you are limited in how much you can give before you start having also effects onto the healthy cells. So you could not quite give enough to keep the cancer under control. And you see here, 3 months later, it has actually evolved as if nothing had been done, and they're given 3 months to live. At this point, the doctor tells them, okay, there's this even more experimental thing, but we don't know what it's going to do to you. Would you like to give your body to science? And a few people said yes and went ahead with it. And so this time they used actinium-225 PSMA. And if you've seen before what I was showing, actinium-225 gives you those 4 alpha particles in very close proximity. So typically you would be giving, instead of giving a few beta rays flying all around, you would have 4 major trucks ramming themselves into the place and really destroying everything in their vicinity. And after those 2 indications, and you can see here, the 3 months mark was really passed already. It was 5 months later, and those patients were still alive. Not only were they alive, all the organs you see in there are the bladder, the kidneys, the liver, which are standard organs that process PSMA. But there are only very, very few highlights that there could be maybe some cancer left here or there. But it was definitely a lot less than before. Just to be certain, they did another injection, and then 2 months later, they came to the conclusion that the patient was in full remission. So they went from maybe you live through Christmas and die to those people 5 years later are still alive today. So that was quite exciting. What the story here doesn't tell is that when they worked with the PSMA, they also hit here the salivary glands. And so those patients have lost a sense of taste and suffer from systematic dry mouth, which is very uncomfortable. And some of them who have, well, since then this has been expanded to create a larger pool of patients to study whether this is indeed a valid course of treatment. And many patients step out from the program because they realize that their quality of life is not improving. Yes, they live longer, but they lose all sense of taste for life. So once again, you have to be careful in what you say and make sure that you take the entirety of the process into account. So it's a very difficult balance to find. However, you can ask that question for yourself. Would you want to live longer or not if you were to lose your sense of taste? It's a bit of a catch-20, but it's one that is sometimes quite important to reflect about. Okay, so that concludes my introduction to the basics of nuclear medicine. Good. So now let me resume the course of the presentation, starting with the diagnostics opportunities with novel radioisotopes. So I'll first give a quick overview of some pairs that are used already in the clinic. So it's not new in that respect, but what more could be done with new radioisotopes, and then especially why the terbium isotopes are so interesting. So I would say the historical theranostics is iodine. It's actually probably one of the first isotopes that was used. When you look back in the literature, I believe the first article is from the end of the 40s already. So we can see that this is something that has a lot of history with it. And the idea there is that you can use iodine 123 for SPECT imaging. It's got a half-life of 13 hours, and now I realized I made a copy-paste error here. Just give me a second. Okay, I have my nuclear chart with me so that I can live correct this for us all. But the iodine 123 is a pure electron capture decay, so it doesn't have any beta plus, which means it is really minimizing the damage. You can see that the gamma ray energy is 160 keV, so it's the right range for what we are interested in. And so it's perfect for SPECT imaging. Then you have iodine 124 for PET imaging. The half-life is a lot longer, it's 4 days, so it allows to see different parts of the biodistribution, where the iodine 123 would give the earlier stages of how it goes in the body, whereas the iodine 124 will take a bit longer. And it has a beta plus decay of 2 MeV, so maybe it will give a bit of a broad picture, but nonetheless it's not too high, so it should still be something reasonable. And then for therapy, there is iodine 131. The half-life is not as indicated on the screen, but is actually 8 days. Voilà, my mistake. The beta minus has an endpoint energy that's below MeV, so that's exactly what you would want for therapy. And it also has a gamma ray at 264 keV. It is not quite as low as you would want for SPECT, but it actually allows you to monitor it nonetheless under a SPECT camera, so that you can see the progress of the treatment, so that you have exactly all the properties that we were saying would be interesting, going from the validation of the treatment with the imaging to the treatment to the validation of the treatment with imaging. So that is used very frequently in patient care. And actually, when you look at the statistics, the iodine therapy for thyroid cancer has treated 10 times more patients than all the nuclear incidents combined have cost in life. So it has saved 10 times more lives than anything, whether it comes from Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or Chernobyl, or Fukushima, or any of the smaller incidents where you may have had trouble with civil or military application of radiation. 10 times more have been treated with that one treatment. So we can see immediately the power that nuclear medicine can have and the positive impact it can have on society, but also the importance of nuclear science for the benefit of society. And this is something that is so often neglected or not seen by the population. When I ask high school kids what they think about nuclear, they talk about nuclear science. They talk about research, they talk about energy, they talk about the risk, radiological risk, environmental risks, the proliferation risks. And I've only had, out of hundreds of pupils that are interviewed, 2 who ever mentioned nuclear medicine. So this is a work that we have to do. We have to raise awareness to nuclear medicine and its benefit for society. So I hope you'll all join me in doing what we can to spread the word. Word of mouth is already a very good start, and then trying to bring that to more attention in our society. Next to this very textbook example of theranostics, there are also pseudo-theranostics that can be used. And a very good picture for that is actually the combination of gallium-68 with lutetium-177, and as we've seen, actinium-225 in the example that I gave for the PSMA. It is not the same element. The chemistry will be different. Gallium, lutetium, actinium, they're not the same at all. However, they belong to a general family, you could say, radiometals. They're not organic part of organic molecules and so on. So the idea is that if you find a chelator that is good for all of them, and typically that is done with the DOTA chelator, then you may hope, and this is already a stretch in itself, that it will have the same pathway in the body. The molecule should not be too different whether you put a gallium or lutetium in there, but you do have to take a certain degree of care in doing those investigations. The advantage of, oh, and sorry, there shouldn't be an M here. You don't want the M, you want the G. There shouldn't be too much difference. But if you look here, especially in the case of lutetium therapy, there are low energy gamma rays that you can use for SPECT imaging. So it means you can do the biodistribution studies and you can do all those investigations with the lutetium itself, although it has a beta minus emission. So you don't want to do the entire study with it, but you can use it to get some glimpse to make sure that everything is fine. Note as well the very high differences in half-life, with the gallium-68 having a half-life of about a bit more than an hour compared to the lutetium that has about a week half-life. So there your time is going to be very different between the two. So you have also to take a certain leap of faith in the process. So it is, if you validated all the protocol and all the pathways, you may use that combination in patient care. However, for the preclinical and original clinical studies, then you have to rely a lot on the lutetium imaging for that. And here you have, as highlights, two of the pictures of how that works. So the one treatment that is clinically approved today with lutetium-177 is the Lutathera, which is lutetium dotatate for endocrine cancer, a cancer of the endocrine system. And the company that produces this, which is AAA Novartis, also provides some kit so that you can collate gallium-68 to the dotatate, and then you can use your favorite supplier. And I've taken here because, of course, we're in Belgium, we have to be proud of what is done here. There is from the Institute of Radioactive Elements in Fleurus a generator for a hospital with that can provide gallium-68. So by combining those two together, you can then obtain an imaging capability to match then the treatment. However, this is not ideal. So instead, you would want to really find pairs of isotopes with which you can work. And you have here a set of different ones, and I've not chosen them at random. It's those that, of course, will be the topic of investigations later, where you can see, for example, scandium-44 and scandium-47. The half-lives are, well, orders of magnitude difference. You go from 4 hours to 3 and a bit days, and one would be for PET imaging, the other one for beta minus therapy. Then you've got the copper 64 and 67, which are more closely matched in half-lives from 12 to 62 hours. And same thing, it's a PET beta minus combination. You also have the erbium isotopes, where the half-lives are 10 hours, 10 days, or 9 days. And then one is used for SPECT imaging, and the other can be used for beta minus therapy, and I believe both are actually favorable for Auger therapy. And then, of course, the one that is the specific warrant of attention, the terbium isotopes. And here, it's not even a pair, it's a quadruplet. There are 4 of them. So it's sometimes called the holy grail of nuclear medicine, or some other people call it the Swiss Army knife of nuclear medicine. It might have to do with the fact that a lot of the investigation were done here in the Alpine region, produced at CERN, and then investigated at the Pulcher Institute in Villingen near Zurich. The 4 isotopes themselves, we start with the heaviest one. You have terbium-161, which is a beta minus emitter, but has also Auger electrons. Has also Auger electrons here, and has a lot of low energy gamma rays that are potentially usable for SPECT imaging as well. Then you've got terbium-155, which is pure electron capture, no beta particles, and has low energy gamma rays as well. So it's ideal for SPECT imaging. Then you have terbium-152, which has a not too high energy beta plus particle, so it's going to be good for PET imaging. And then you've got terbium-149, which has a usable alpha decay branch, but also has low energy beta plus, so that you can do PET imaging during the alpha treatment. Terbium-149 is actually very special because if you make a survey of that area, of the radiolanthanides as a whole, and you look for an isotope that has a substantial alpha branch, but a half-life that's long enough for nuclear medicine, but not too long that you can still actually use it, then you are left with only one isotope, terbium-149. So it is a very important one for those investigations. But what is really exciting here is once you find a vector that is working with terbium, then you can apply whichever isotope you want to switch between imaging and therapy. So it makes it very potent and allows you to do a lot of different activities with it. What is also important to look at is the match of biodistribution to half-life. And you can see here the range of half-life that you have, with the top two, 149, 152, ranging in the hours, 4, 17.5, and then the bottom two, 155 and 161, having days half-life, nearly a week half-life to both of them. So it means you will probably more see them used in pairs, either of one or the other, depending on the vector to which you attach it. So okay, fine, terbium isotopes, very good. How are those actually produced? Let's start again in the same order with terbium-161 first, and then the idea is you actually do neutron capture on enriched gallium-160 to produce gallium-161, which has a short half-life and beta decays to terbium-161. And then you simply perform the radiochemistry of terbium to gadolinium, and you get yourself a pure terbium-161 sample, no carrier added. So that's ideal. That's exactly what you want for your investigation. The purity will depend on how enriched your material is at the start, but given that it's the heaviest of the gadolinium, it's and that there is a very nice gap between 158 and 160, then it should not be too difficult to get high purity material. This technique is actually not new at all, and it's very frequently employed at the BR2 to produce samples with which the colleagues from NUHA and also investigators at the University Hospital in Leuven have been working and developing a lot of interesting techniques with terbium-161, and I'll show a bit of that later in this lecture. Okay, so we've got terbium-161. Congratulations. Now, what about the others? So you can either start from a gadolinium target and do PN or PXN reaction, proton fusion evaporation, as we've seen in our previous lectures. But if you do that, you actually have a big problem. You start with a mixture of different gadolinium isotopes. And even if you try to enrich, you will never manage to have a pure enough sample to work with. The second point is you want to go all the way to terbium-149. And if you start here from, say, even if you take a lighter one, and I believe you could potentially get gadolinium-152 samples here enriched into that isotope because it has a very long half-life, it will still be 1, 2, 3, 4 particles emitted. And you can see how problematic it becomes, because of course, when you go to P4N, you also have to consider the PP3N and P2P2N and all the other weird channels that you can have along the way. And if you start from a heavier gadolinium target, you have even more. And considering also the energy you need, well, it's an energy that is appropriate for ISOL phase 1. However, there are not many facilities in Europe today that can deliver that. Actually, there is one, the Aronnax cyclotron in Nantes, that has been doing this sort of research. Beyond that, there are other facilities looking at other possibilities. For example, looking at europium alpha XN. The advantage here is you start from a single target material. Europium is going to be very pure, very clean, so you do not have to worry so much about the target enrichment. But the number of neutrons you need to boil from this are a lot higher, and the multiple open channels remain a major problem. And this is actually a line of production that is being investigated in Birmingham at the moment. And with gadolinium, you can also work with deuteron beam, and I believe this is one of the paths that is chosen at Aronnax. Okay, so if those two are not quite practical, how is it actually done today at CERN? And that is done via the spallation of a tantalum target. So because they come with very high energy, they can produce a lot of different things. Not only is that a practical way, but they do not need to extract the terbium. So in the same way that in BR2, we start with gadolinium and let it decay to the terbium, what they do at CERN is they extract dysprosium and let the dysprosium decay into the terbium. But those dysprosium have a very short half-life of the order of minutes or sometimes seconds. So you do need to run this in online mode. You cannot go offline. So for example, certain medicines cannot work with dysprosium beams. Instead, they work directly with terbium from, well, because all the dysprosium has already decayed into terbium inside the target material. But it is a lot more challenging because the chemistry of terbium is not very favorable to get it out of the target matrix. And that we've seen can be something important in the ISOL technology. Okay, good. So is there anything left to say about that? Yes, actually, the cross-section, that's the first thing you look at when you're looking at production. And this is something we've investigated in greater detail, actually, for the spallation of tantalum, for the reason that there were discrepancies, and you can see the discrepancy here in the terbium-114 in production, where you could see those points here were twice as high as the points down there, and that was a question left to be answered, like what was the origin of that? It turned out that it was shortcoming in the analysis of those original points from 1964. Here, when you actually renormalize them to better branching ratio measurements, you can see how those points here are actually in much better agreement with the rest of the data. Nonetheless, we were able to complete what had been done before and get an increased knowledge on those cross sections. And you can see here with the red bars what energy we operate at with the proton synchrotron booster at CERN compared to what the phase 2 of ISOL at Mira should be able to deliver with the 600 MeV. And what is important to notice here is that the cross section for the production of terbium is not affected, but the cross-section for the production of cerium, which has been identified as being the main contaminant in the ISOL beam in the form of cerium oxide, is actually not produced, is below threshold at the energy delivered at ISOL Amira. So it means that the samples that will be produced at ISOL Amira, if we ever go to that direction and to the spallation of tantalum, will be of much higher purity before radiochemistry already than those from the CERN Isolde and Medicis facilities. Another step that's important once you've collected the sample is to do radiochemistry on it, because you have to collect the radioisotopes, whether you get them from the gadolinium sample or whether you get them from a foil. In our case, it is zinc coating on gold. You have to find ways of separating it and isolating only the terbium isotopes you want. And as a radiolanthanide, it is not a trivial process to be done. And this is something that was investigated at the Polscher Institute as part of their investigations in the last 15 to 20 years. And they have a very good protocol, but it's one that is somewhat demanding and creates a lot of waste. So that is also something that still requires further investigations today. And I believe this is part of what is being done, but I'll come back to that at SCK, but I'll come back to that when I talk about the IRMA project. The Polscher Institute managed to get regular deliveries of terbium isotopes, and by regular I mean twice a year in minute quantities, but nonetheless it was enough for them to start to do preclinical investigations. And they were looking at different aspects of the use of terbium by doing in vitro and in vivo investigations. And you can see, for example, in the picture on the right here, the terbium-152 PET imaging, then the terbium-155 SPECT imaging, and then the terbium-161 SPECT imaging. Both on phantoms and on small animals with, well, on tumor-bearing mice. And at the bottom, you can see from the subsequent publication a few years later how they used PET imaging on tumor-bearing mice using terbium-149. There is also one major difference between the pictures in this part here in the 2012 publication with respect to those from the 2016 publication, and it is located in this region. You can see here how the kidney were lighting up a lot, and that was because the vector, which is a folate derivative here, was actually being taken up in the kidney in a lot. So they actually eventually added this little bit here to make the system heavier, to make it stay in the bloodstream longer and not being taken up by the kidney. And you can see here how the kidney are almost not lighting up. So that's also going back to the question that we had before. Is it possible to find ways to avoid the uptake in certain organs? And the answer is yes, but not always. And it's always, and for each vector, it's a different study that have to be done. But with that, they were able to show that the terbium isotopes can indeed be used for all sorts of activities, and that was very exciting research. It actually triggers to a great extent the construction of the CERN Medicis infrastructure. In the UK, at the National Physical Laboratory, they actually pushed the imaging investigation into looking how to use terbium-155 on a clinical SPECT camera. They have one over there that they've managed to reproduce in GN4 simulation to great accuracy, so that they can actually collect data and then manipulate the data to sort of see how to refine the parameters of the camera itself, so that you could technically only send a little plugin upgrade to the hospital and tell them, if you're doing terbium-155, go to terbium-155 mode, and it tells you exactly which mask to use and which energy settings, which energy cuts to use, what algorithm to use to subtract background and get the highest energy efficiency. So the difference here between the blue and the red curves are the two different masks that you can apply before the camera. If you remember when I said about SPECT imaging, you can have different directions, you can have different openings, you can have different length, and those are very important parameters. So here they used two different ones to see which one would actually give the best image quality. And finally, the team at PSI managed to bring to Germany a sample of terbium-152 and test it in, again, this time the PSMA, and compare it to gallium-68 PSMA. Well, it was not the same vector, okay, it's PSMA 617 to PSMA 11, but nonetheless, it gives already a good idea. What is important to realize here is the difference in half-life between the two. So with only 1 hour in gallium-68, you always have a lot of it still being in the blood flow, not yet having landed in its final destination before it decays. So this is why, if you look at the pictures on the right, you have a lot of areas flashing up and not very high definition. But when you go to the terbium-152, because the half-life is longer, it will first go to its destination before you start collecting a lot of data on it. And this is why the images are a lot sharper and provide you a much better contrast. So that way they actually, in this picture, and identified bone metastases and cancerous nodes that were not identifiable with the gallium-68. But then, if terbium is so great, what's the problem? And that's the famous medical conundrum that I highlighted before. And it's the idea that if it is not in the clinic, nobody's producing it. If it's not produced, it's not available for research. If there is no research, it will not go to the clinic. And then you go on this no demand, no production, no research vicious cycle that you can break out of. You see also now on the right this pie chart from the NUPEC report on nuclear medicine from a few years back. Well, it starts to date, but I don't think the picture has changed so much. And you can see how 70%, oh no, even more than that, 80% of the isotopes that are used in nuclear medicine is technetium-99m in Europe, and it's even worse in the US. And that PET is maybe 10% at most. So there is a lot of room left, even just in imaging, without even thinking of going to the therapy side of things. So we need to break that conundrum. And the idea is, how do we break that conundrum? And I'll go to that to you in a second. But first, we can enjoy our second break. So the third section for today is the production of those novel isotopes that I'm so excited about using the ISOL technique. And I will start with the CERN Medicis facility, which is working right now today, delivering beams. And then I will talk about the Terbium Irma V project, which is, I would say, the Flanders dimension to this prospect. And finally, the PRISMAP consortium, which is trying to put a European spin and a European perspective on all of it. So MEDICIS. MEDICIS stands for Medical Isotopes Collected from ISOL. It is a facility. You can see actually here the laser lab of MEDICIS is at the top, and here at the bottom, that's the entrance to our facility. And here at the back, you can see the ISOL facility, so that they are very much linked to one another, but also they are different facilities from each other. So you already know a bit about ISOL, but let's see where MEDICIS fits in that picture. So here you have what we call the BTY line, which is the line that comes from Proudhon Brewster, and here it branches off towards the HRS target, so one of the two target stations at ISOL. And here, when the beam goes through the target, it actually hits a second target that we see now running away after it has been irradiated before the beam dump. It is retrieved from the high radiation area that is over there by a radiation-hard monorail system. You can see here it's slightly moved out of position so that you see it goes through a bit of a gate so that the air volumes are completely separated with under pressure in the high radiation area. It then goes through this wall, and if the line doesn't seem to join, it's normal. It's actually because there is a chicane in this concrete wall so that the radiation, gamma neutrons, don't come out so easily. From there, it comes to sort of a landing platform where the irradiated target unit can be picked up by a robotic arm. You can see a glimpse of that arm on the left, and then it is put back on a front end in a bunker that is a copy of the ISOL front end, followed by a dipole magnet, which was donated from the Leuven isotope separator online facility when it was decommissioned from Louvain-la-Neuve. And then you bring that to a collection chamber and a radiochemistry lab so that you can collect the isotope and dispatch it in a matter of a few hours. So here you have maybe a picture that I presented before about the ISOL facility, where you have the, where you have here the low energy beams of ISOL, in particular the CRIS experiment located here that we discussed a few times. And in this region over here, you have the high energy beams where they do nuclear reactions, but actually the protons here come onto the target. And what we've done is we've put a second target behind it before the beam dump so that you can irradiate it and then take it back, this time to the MEDICIS facility, which you find here at the back. Yep. Okay. So what happens here is that you get this Medisys facility, as I've mentioned before, where we have the Montrake monorail system that delivers the targets to the landing platform. Then we have a robotic arm, which is the same as the one used at the different ISOL front end to load and unload the targets so that they all can be manipulated by the same team at CERN. By the way, for those of you who are a bit of tech geeks, KUKA is making a lot of robotic arms, especially in the automotive assembly. So it is the same that you can see sometimes in commercials, for example, for Mercedes. There we also have the ISOL separator magnet, and you can see here two very happy faces. It is that of Mark Heiser, who was my PhD promoter when I did my PhD on that separator in Louvain-la-Neuve, together with Giselle, who was my first PhD student in Leuven, and she is responsible for the installation of that magnet at the Medisys facility. And then we have the collection point from which we can retrieve the isotopes by maintaining, of course, a safe distance, because we try to collect very high activity samples of the order of hundreds of megabecquerel, gigabecquerel if we could, so that we don't want to irradiate the personnel with it. It is an offline separator meant for medical research, and it operates either with isotopes from CERN or from external sources, and that makes it a very powerful machine that is used quite a lot. So here we will see, sorry, there seems to be a problem here. Okay. Solved. How we go about producing this terbium-149 that we are so keen on having. So you first start with the irradiation. It takes in itself, ideally, well, let's say 3 to 4 half-life. So that makes it about 16 hours until you saturate in that isotope. Then you have to bring it to the front end, set up the front end, which means pump any sort of gas, outgassing that would have happened, slowly heat it because you don't want to trip the high voltage, and get into a condition that you can run. In itself, it takes about 3 hours. In the typical Isolde fashion, they would actually use a lot more time to do that. But because you are rushing against a half-life, you need to keep it as short as possible. So they can do that at Medisys in 3 hours. Then you do the collection itself, which can be a few hours. And then you see how time is increasing. And then you have shipping. But prior to shipping, you also have to consider that you have some form of quality assurance in the process. And so if you put that on the timeline, you would say that you start the day before and irradiate overnight, and then you start the process in the morning. By 10:30, you start the collection. By 1:30, you're done with collection, and you can ship in early afternoon. Then you add to that 3 to 4 hours to drive it to PSI, and you see that how this is arriving by the end of day, evening at PSI. So actually, they were doing most of their radiochemistry by night or by evening, and looking at the mice in night shift. So this is not a very practical system. But you can see also how you lose with time, because if you look at the production, you see how it rises exponentially and reaches at some point close to saturation, but it also decays exponentially. And you have to factor that into determining how much material you will be able to bring to, in this case, the Medical Research Center. So the setup is taking a lot of time, including vacuum pumping, water cooling, target heating, beam optimization, and so on and so forth. And then between collection and shipping, as I mentioned, you have minimum quality controls, decay spectroscopy, packaging, loading, paperwork if you go international. And those things are actually non-negligible and have to be considered quite seriously. So it is not a trivial process, although it's one that we are excited about. So then the Medisys collaboration itself, it was born from Isolde, but it is a separate entity. The project itself to build the infrastructure was approved in 2013, and the facility was commissioned in December 2017 when Giselle, my student, managed to extract the first radioisotopes from the facility. And we operated also during the long shutdown too in 2019 and 20, which is something very peculiar at CERN, that we were able to operate with the externally provided sources. The way we work is with a collaboration board that discuss technical, financial, managerial matters, as well as the scientific matters. And for that, we have 12 institutes on top of CERN from different countries represented here. So you have Belgium, Germany, France, Latvia, Pakistan, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, and the UK. And those that are underlined there, so Latvia, Pakistan, Portugal, and Switzerland, are not members of the ISOL collaboration, for example. We also have the European Association of Nuclear Medicine, the EANM, as an advisory member of the board, in the sense that they do not financially or technologically contribute, but they are part of the scientific discussions that are ongoing. And we have over 30 projects that have been approved, and some of them have already been completed in the last few years, including some that are actually led by KU Leuven and by the SCK. So, well, commissioning was 2017, but let's say it was December. It was just to really say we had something coming out of the magnet. But the first true activity was done in 2018, where we performed 26 target irradiation that year in order to demonstrate that the machine was working, but it was very much showing how the system was going altogether. We also separated externally imported sources from ILL, and that was very important to demonstrate that we could do so in 2019 and 20. The activities collected were still rather small, listed up there, but combined all together between terbium and thulium, we were able to extract a gigabecquerel of activity from that year. So that was quite successful. In terms, we only had surface ionization as a capability at the time, and we reached 5% efficiency, which is something that had taken decades in Isolde, and we could already demonstrate so from the Medicis facility within a year, which showed how valuable the experience from Isolde could be transferred into Medicis. So that was a very nice sign of the synergies between the facilities. And then we developed also some new developments. For example, here on the right, you can see a new target container that was being investigated that should be more appropriate for Medicis, or here a big contraption that was made to study target materials, novel target materials for ISOL production. And the radiochemistry could not be performed at CERN at the time, so isotopes were shipped to the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, which was a big overhead in transport, so of course we were limited for the most radioactive isotopes, and then dispatched sample to the University Hospital of Geneva, of Lausanne, and to a radiopharmacy research center in Lisbon. In 2019, the facility had to operate 100% with imported sources, and those were from the ILL nuclear reactor in Grenoble and the Aronnax cyclotron in Nantes, so both from France. We took the opportunity to install the MELISA resonance ionization laser laboratory so that we could perform resonance ionization as well, and that proved to be very successful. You see that in the 2021 especially achievements. We studied how to extract terbium from gadolinium, and then concluded that pre-separation by radiochemistry was essential. Otherwise, the ion source was so saturated and overwhelmed that we could not perform any separation whatsoever. We also identified that the original ionization schemes for terbium was, coincidentally in enhancing gadolinium as well, which was a bit of a problem. So we had to develop a new laser ionization scheme at the time. And then it was 15 collections that were done on terbium, erbium, ytterbium, and collected also nearly a gigabecquerel of activity that was provided to KU Leuven, to the Geneva University Hospital, NPL in the UK, and PSI near Zurich. Then in 2020, we developed, as you see at the top, a new way to more efficiently inject the material into the target unit from the external sources, and that way we could operate again quite efficiently with samples from Aronax, but also from the proton injector 2 cyclotron at PSI. So that way we had two different proton sources, and also the BR2 was used to provide sample of samarium at Medicis, and we also received an actinium sample, 2 actinium samples from the GRC in Karlsruhe. So that that allowed us to open our portfolio of sources and do a lot more activity there. We also installed the gamma ray detector here outside of the collection chamber, a cadmium zinc telluride detector. It's very compact, doesn't require cooling, so that was very practical to monitor the acquisition on the go, and that allowed us to actually help with the tuning and the startup to know how high in heating, for example, you need to go from the ion source before you start seeing things in the system, but also to see when your activity had saturated, for example, if you have depleted the sample you had in the ion source. So that was very nice. And we started developing, as you can see here, the radio chemistry for the radiolanthanides. We had also one test performed here with actinium on a thorium oxide matrix in order to study the production of that isotope, as said, how important it was. In total, the activity was a bit less. We only produced 540 megabecquerel, but of course we'll have to realize this was the COVID year, and the pandemic hit hard right when the machine was supposed to restart, so that it had to be put in safe mode and we could not operate for several months in the year. Nonetheless, we were able to deliver those different isotopes to Leuven, to NPL and PSI. There as well, a lot of the partner institutes who could otherwise receive isotopes got very limited in their activities, which affected, of course, what we could do with the machine. And this year, the year is not over yet, so we're still in operation, but nonetheless, it's been a very good year. This time was a mixed operation, so we had CERN-produced radioisotopes as well as external sources from ILL, BR2, and PSI. We did quite some investigations. One major problem we've observed related to the high throughput we have is not only that we saturate the ion source, but we start to sputter material from our collection targets. And you can see that very nicely here with this spot where the zinc material has been burnt and removed from the collection foil. So we are trying to look at different techniques, different materials that we can use in order to overcome that problem. We've also devised a new gas injection system so that we can try to do the extraction of isotope in molecular form, like scandium fluoride. We've developed new target materials. So here you can see titanium foils. We've improved the operation of the laser system. We've automated some of our radiochemistry. We have a new glove box so that we can work with different target materials. I mean, there has been a lot of work and a lot of improvement that came in 2021 to the facility. With that, we also had record-breaking collections, especially in the ytterbium and the thulium. Those were fantastic collections, and we expanded our portfolio by also adding barium, scandium, and mercury to what we had done before. And together we collected over 1.3 gigabecquerel of activity, and the year is not over. We still have a few collections to come up. And that was shipped to PSI, to Leuven, back to the SCK for the samarium, to NPL, to Lausanne, and so on. So it has been quite a successful year. Also with its struggle, of course, I don't want to say everything went 100%, but you can see that the facility is very active and progressing a lot. So next, the success of certain medicines, I now want to come to what's happening on the Flanders side, and that's the terbium IRMA-V project, and that stands for terbium ISOL radioisotopes for medical application in Flanders. So the V is for Vlaanderen, not 5. That's a slide that I showed at my inaugural lecture, but I wanted to bring again. And that's just to highlight the leadership that Belgium has in molecular imaging, especially. The university hospitals all across Flanders and also the Institut Jules Bordet, UZ Louvain, UZ Liège, and so on and so forth, have a very strong commitment to developing new technology related to molecular imaging. I've talked about the molecules, but here I also have this picture of the smiling llamas from which you can extract nanobodies that are used also for targeted action. We should not forget as well the Institute for Radioactive Element in Fleurus. That is one of the few places that can produce the technetium-99M generators, or how BR2 is the research reactor in the world with the largest production capacity for Moly-99 for the technetium-99M production, and IBA, that is a world leader in cyclotron and accelerator-based radioisotope production. So there is a lot going on, and I show here also at the top the logo from the Belgian Molecular Imaging Consortium, the BMIC. It is a group coordinated by PhD students on molecular imaging that is so strong that it has inspired a European equivalent, but there are still the highest number of participants in it. So there is this very strong mentality, this force, and it's important that we keep this going and we support it with the radioisotopes that are needed to develop it even further. So that's the idea with the terbium IRMA-V program. And here the idea is to really push the terbium onto the Belgian research front by developing its production using the ISOL technique, by developing the purification and distribution, by investigating it in radiopharmacy and in preclinical settings, and hopefully bringing it towards clinical practice. So we want to cover all those stages in our project. Of course, it is built on the backbone of ISOL at MIRA. This is not something that can be avoided, and many in the audience are going to be much more knowledgeable about that project and its status than I. But what is very important to know is that the Belgian federal government has actually supported the funding of that facility in its phase 1 program, represented in blue here, where there will be 100 MeV, 500 microamp proton beam available to irradiate different targets and produce radioactive ion beams for research and for medical applications. So this is something that will require a lot of investigations, and it is no coincidence, right, that I am giving this lecture series at this moment, because we have to really strongly look at what will be done in that facility, and the radioactive ion beams that will be created will be used most definitely for both fundamental research but also medical applications. So then we wanted to show, okay, what can we do, what research do we need for the medical side of things with the terbium isotopes? And this is what we've been looking at with the production side of things. There we have to look at how this dramatic increase of power we will have on the target with respect to what is done at ISOL will impact the target material itself. So looking at new structure, but also here you can see how TRIUMPH has to handle its target module. I mean, you can see the people at the back of this picture, how tiny they are with respect to here. You can see people with respect to the size of this monster compared to here an ISOL target unit. And just to give you an idea, I'm going to stand next to it. So the increase in power induces a lot of increase in engineering that has to be very much considered and investigated. So that's the sort of things that we have to look at. But the other thing that I've highlighted in many of the lectures is how we might struggle with the throughput through the ion source. And my colleagues here were telling me in the last few days, oh, Thomas, we've noticed this problem in the terbium production with how we saturate the target and how we are not able to produce as much as we wanted with the laser ion source. And there you see that it actually is one of the crucial parts that has to be investigated these days. So for that, we are doing a lot of different works. And here I would like to especially put the attention to the work of Benji, who's in the audience today, I believe, but also Victoria from my group, who are working on the, EMA students, working on different simulations, testing new materials, testing new ion sources, and so on and so forth. But also looking at the cross-section, and for example, the work I presented earlier is very important to that, so that we really understand what energy is most appropriate to operate and the facility and produce those isotopes. Then we have to look also at the ion source. So laser scheme development is important. And I mentioned there how in 2019, we actually developed new ionization schemes, but also looking at the temperature distribution. And here you see in the top left also the ambient dose is also an important aspect. So this is something that has to be taken very carefully. And if you remember, the ion source load is something that I have highlighted many times in my lectures. Then comes the purification. I mentioned this would come back, and that's the radiochemistry. How do you in particular separate the terbium from the gadolinium, either from the reactor side or if you go from the proton or deuteron induced reaction. And that's the word of Miriam at the SCK, who's been looking into new form of oxidation of the terbium isotopes in the hope of being able to stabilize it and get to separate it in a much easier form than using the alpha HIBA technique that was developed at PSI. And they're actually already applying some of those aspects with terbium-161 that's produced at the BR2. Then there is the distribution that's also important. So you have to consider how to change the distribution going from, especially for alpha emitters. So you have here two different type of transport container with here a type A container, which is very expensive, very heavy, very difficult to handle logistically, and then next to it, a type B container. And a type B container is something that you can put in the back of a truck and drive with. A type A container is something that's going to be highly regulated. And those are based on estimate of what are the risks associated with that transport. And thankfully, recently, the IAEA revised its criteria on terbium-149 and 161 and raised it. It used to be a few megabecquerels. Now they moved it to hundreds of gigabecquerels, which is a game changer, but not on the imaging one. And next to that, you have in the second columns what my master student computed should actually be for those. And you see that there again, there are orders of magnitude increase that can be brought forward. This was communicated to FONC and to CERN, and responsible persons are bringing it to the attention of the IAEA. So we can hope that our work will actually impact international legislation in the future. There you have also the radiopharmaceutical research, and that's the work of Erwin, also here at DSCK. And he is first looking, well, he's looking at how to use the terbium in new radiopharmaceuticals. And in this case, he was interested into combining it with nanobodies. But to combine a radioisotope with nanobodies, you need to cook your system at low temperature. If you bring it to very high temperature, you will destroy the nanobody. So for that, you need the chelation to happen at very low temperature, or at body temperature of typically 35 to 40 degrees, instead of the 90 degrees at which the DOTA chelator is normally prepared. And this is something that was investigated in partnership between SCK and the radiopharmacy laboratory in Leuven, and they were able to demonstrate all the sort of advantages and what was possible. And that DOTA was actually also one of those working at low temperatures. So that was good. And there they looked also at the biodistribution of those isotopes in just random and also in collated samples, and they could demonstrate which one were stable or not. They were also, with terbium-155 provided from certain medicines, able to do phantom studies as well as in vivo imaging using molecules. So that shows that those things are progressing and advancing, which was very exciting to observe. So here you have an overview of our consortium. We are very active and doing a lot of research, and so there will be a lot more results coming up in the near future. So the time is running out, but I still wanted to give you a quick insight into PRISMAP, which is the European side of things. And there it's a network financed by the European Commission to really try to promote those novel radioisotopes by creating a single access platform through which people can request those isotopes, as well as a distributed set of centers where people can do their preclinical investigation and share those facilities, as well as basic research into improving those facilities and networking on their prospect in terms of education or communication. As you can see here, it's spread over quite a large part of Europe, but of particular attention is the fact that this involves the SCK here and KU Leuven as well. And there is also, if I find it back, yes, and there is also CERN involved in this consortium. So you see how this actually revolves around a few pillars, with here what we call the Belgian pillar. Around here you have the Alpine pillar. And then there is also an important one here in Poland and here in the north. Those are the different isotopes that we offer as our day one isotopes, and you can recognize many: the scandium, the copper, the terbium, the erbium, but also things like actinium, which you can combine with lanthanum-135 for imaging, and so on and so forth. So all of those are the isotopes that we are willing to offer from the start, and samarium-153, which prospects were mostly established thanks to the work of the SCK. So here you can have, following the links displayed on the slides, more information about those different isotopes. What does PRISMAP offer? It's called a translational access. Transnational access. It's the idea that you cross borders. So we want to produce high quality radioisotopes, non-carrier added, with also access to medical research laboratories, and even sometimes to offer the full service of doing the research on behalf of the interested party. So that's quite a broad portfolio with a lot of partners involved in it. Who is actually our target user base? And those would be research groups where the group leader and the majority of the users are from a country other than the one from which the service is offered. For example, someone from Belgium would not be able to receive isotope from BR2 because there are other channels in Belgium to do that. But someone from the other side of Europe would. Or someone from Belgium could request isotopes from Aronnax or from the Hervesi lab in Copenhagen. Then the users themselves need to be affiliated to an academic research institution or non-academic research institution. SCK is definitely eligible. A research hospital as well, a research department of a small company as well, and so on. So it's really broad, but it has to be towards research. You cannot order those to play in your garage with it. And then the research project itself must aim at medical applications of the radioisotopes. And we are very proud to announce that since last Friday, the first call for radioisotopes is open. So I invite you to follow the link that's at the bottom here. Prismap.eu is our website, access for reading about the call, and we are now starting to take input from the call. So please consider the interest and look into what you would be most interested in potentially working with. We are also organizing an event related to that call the day after tomorrow in the morning, where we will give a broader information session about what PRISMAP will be about. And again, if you are interested about this, it's a very good opportunity for you to register for that event and follow it online. So it will be hybrid. I will myself be actually in the auditorium there, but it is meant to go towards our user base. So please, if you are interested or intrigued, follow the event. And I believe the link is in the chat. So with a bit delay, I think it's been my longest lecture so far, but we had also quite a few questions already, 2 breaks, so that's probably why. I would like to conclude by having a quick overview of what we discussed today. So we first had a look at some basics of nuclear medicine, how functional imaging works and how it has to be combined with structural imaging to give you all the information you need. How you switch then to targeted radionuclide therapy to go to treatment, and how you can combine both towards personalized medicine with theranostics, either with existing isotope pairs or with novel isotopes like the scandium, copper, erbium, or the terbium quadruplet. The access to those radioisotopes is actually what's holding back a lot of the theranostics development, and we are trying to use the ISOL technique to break out of that conundrum. And that has been done already for 4 years now at Sun Medicus. We've delivered 3.7 gigabecquerel of radioisotope for research, so that's quite a lot already. Then in Flanders, we are looking within the Terbium ERMAV consortium at upscaling the research in the terbium isotopes at all stages of the chain to open opportunities in Flanders, and especially in light of the new ISOL at Mira facility. And then finally, I brought the attention over PRISMAP, where we will offer a European-wide opportunity, and it should not be missed. Everyone should have a look at what is possible there. So with this, we conclude the one before last lecture. There is still one left next week. As mentioned earlier, it will also be online. And then I will be discussing some extra topics about how to go from research to patient care with those novel isotopes, with some challenges and prospect about the distribution of radioisotopes, about what goes on after the collection. So maybe go a bit deeper into radiochemistry, radiopharmacy, and preclinical research. And finally, how we have to look at the nuclear data as part of bringing those radioisotopes to the clinic. Voila. Thank you for today.